Hello and welcome to today's podcast on the investigator's dilemma, balancing complexity, conflicts, and human drama in high stakes cases. I am Veena Gopalakrishnan, an employment law partner at Trilegal in India. I'm joined by a panel of absolute powerhouses, women whose experience, insight, and emotional intelligence make them some of the best voices on this subject. Ladies, may I please request you to introduce yourselves?
So I'm Natasha Lecellier. I am a partner at the French law firm Fichy Granger Avocat based in Paris.
Hi, my name is Michelle Stutz. I'm from MME, a law firm in Switzerland, Zug and Zurich.
Hi, I'm Emma Bartlett. I'm partner at CM Murray. Thank you, Veena, for a lovely introduction.
Good morning, good afternoon. My name is Emily Coffer. I'm a senior director with Air Canada.
Thank you, everyone. So, if you've ever been involved in workplace investigations, you'll know that they're no longer just a check the box compliance exercise. Investigations today are deeply human moments, people at their most vulnerable, careers and reputations on the line, organizational culture under pressure, and leadership teams looking for answers. At the center of it all, it is the investigator navigating high stakes with limited protection and enormous responsibility. In-house counsel, like Emily, grapple with business continuity, culture repair. Private practitioners, like the rest of us, worry about privilege, scope creep, and trauma-informed interviewing. Across all roles and jurisdictions, we're increasingly confronted today by public opinion, internal power dynamics, and our own biases. Investigators end up having to balance empathy and objectivity, deal with urgency and uncertainty, and make ethical calls in situations where facts are blurry and emotions are high. In this conversation, we're diving into the unique pressures of being that investigator, the detective, counselor, strategist, and sometimes the scapegoat. So let's start with you, Emily. How important is it to define the scope of an investigation? Talk to us about your process on drawing up the scope and addressing scope creep.
So I think identifying process and scope is very unique and distinct for an internal. Often the struggle comes with accepting the mandate and trying to also delineate from investigating everything proverbially in the kitchen sink. And that includes all areas of misconduct. So there may be points throughout the process where managing various people's expectations, including the complainant, perhaps witnesses, as well as senior leaders, it's going to be very important to have those touch points and have that communication to ensure that the scope remains consistent. It doesn't evolve to the point where, you can no longer, participate or reflect on what was the original mandate. But also bearing in mind that as the internal, you may be privy to additional information that requires a conversation or an examination at a later point in time. That looks very different, of course, for an external who has those terms neatly set out in a term of reference or in a retainer agreement. That retainer agreement could mean very little internally if those perceptions aren't managed from the onset.
Natasha, you've been both internal and external. Is there a big difference?
Yes and no. Obviously, when you're an internal investigator, the way Emily is, you know the company, you know the people. This really saves you time in scoping out the investigation and obtaining the information you need. And also, you have a better understanding of the internal politics and where you could be being manipulated. Unfortunately, that does happen sometimes. But it also means that it can be more difficult to stay objective, and it can get very tricky if you find yourself in a situation where there is obstruction by management because you're part of the company and they are the people you work for. As an external investigator, the real challenge is you've got a very sharp learning curve because an investigation, you don't have much time to carry it out. And you've got to get a grips with the organization's business, its structure, its culture, because otherwise you won't be asking the right questions. But the good news is that it is easier to be impartial and to be a little bit more demanding. So when people don't want to answer questions or start to, be difficult, you can be a bit more demanding, especially if you're willing to take the risk to never work for that client again.
Michelle, let me ask you a question on where does the investigation really lie? Who should own the investigation? Should it be the company, the board with the compliance department, or an independent investigative body? When does a company really decide whether it should run the investigation internally or hand it over to an independent, impartial investigator?
Who should own an investigation really depends on the seriousness and who is implicated. Routine lower risk issues can be handled by management, HR, or compliance, while matters involving systematic compliance breaches or financial controls are mostly handled by external counsel. Also, allegations against senior leadership should be handled by external counsel. And for high stakes or regulatory sensitive cases, an independent external investigator provides also the strongest credibility and impartiality. If HR or other internal employees lead such high stakes investigations, the process may lack independence and credibility, while gaps in expertise and evidence handling can weaken defensibility and increase the legal or reputational risk.
I've sometimes seen even external investigators struggle to maintain neutrality, and perhaps, Emma, this is a question for you. Have you ever encountered situations where senior leaders have downplayed your concerns or delegitimized your space as an independent investigator? How do you push back? How do you hold your ground and say, stop digging?
That's an excellent question, and one that happens more often than you might think, where the firm or organization, company instructing you as an independent investigator, or indeed as an advisor to an investigation, where they just want to move on, and they think, sometimes you think, I don't know why you've asked me the question to do the investigation or to advise on the investigation. If all they want you to do is say, can we do this? And you don't need to do the full investigation. It just needs to be this. So the way I've dealt with it in the past is to think very seriously about what are the implications of not doing an independent investigation. As Michelle was saying just then, when it's a high stakes matter, something that could be referred to a regulator, you want to make sure that whatever investigation is undertaken is appropriate and necessary, bearing in mind that your regulator may then want to understand how seriously, given the gravity of a situation, how seriously the organisation has taken it and whether they have carried out the right steps. So it's a question of reminding the organisation that this is important to do it right and do a proportionate investigation so that they can stand before their regulator and say we did the right thing. And then secondly, where it's a really serious issue, whether that's something financial, compliance, or something related to discrimination or harassment in particular, you want to make sure that you are living up to the standards that your own internal culture say that you will do. If your culture says we're going to take this sort of thing seriously, then you have to take it seriously. So it's just sometimes just more than once reminding people why you're doing it, and therefore it's not necessarily me digging my heels in, but it's me bringing people along with me in terms of reminding people that this is important and the reasons why it's important.
Thank you for that, Emma. I think that's valuable. Emily and Natasha, the next question for both of you, and maybe you could bring in the perspective of being an internal investigator here. As an internal investigator, how did you help organization move forward after the investigation? And is the investigator required to be involved in both reform and remediation?
In terms of moving forward after the investigation, I think, like I said, having that communication throughout the course of the investigation, particularly early on, to define the mandate and make that part of the conversation, that beyond the findings, recommendations are vital to the prevention side and the restoration side, which is a large portion of going beyond whether you substantiate or not particular findings. In those recommendations, it's important to consider whether there's any systematic or systemic behaviors that were also being explored and what impact the events in question had on the larger workforce. And to that end, working with various stakeholders, the internal is well suited to make those recommendations. Training is one I hear very frequently. I think it's an important tool if used properly. For me, it suggests that the employer is investing in the employees. This is not a punitive, outcome of something, but something that speaks to a broader, like I mentioned, restoration piece. And again, looking at the specifics that led to the filing of the complaint, as well as understanding the relationships. Is this a unionized workforce? Is it a workforce that has management presence? What does that look like? Is there cultural issues at play here? What do seniority, speak to when it comes to some of these issues? So to answer your the second part of the question, yes, I do believe that as an internal, it's important not to skew the findings, but in light of those findings, be a part of that prevention and a part of that restoration, given the information you may be privy to and the relationships of trust and the relationships that you want to build throughout that sort of continuum, one that speaks to your impartiality as well as your more global prevention involvement with the organization?
It's a really interesting question and actually quite challenging one. Usually an investigation is there to find out, what happened, okay? But it's also there to either stop something going on, punish people for something that they did wrong, and of course learn from the experience so that you take the measure so you lessen the risk of it happening again. So you always have those things in mind. However, it is really challenging sometimes to do an investigation while you're also having in mind that you're going to be making recommendations for the outcome of the investigation, because I have found that sometimes it influences you during the investigation, i.e. you sort of get this idea of, oh, this is what the problem, this is how it has to be solved, and it takes up your mind space that you should be keeping on actually doing the investigation. So I felt that a lot when I was an internal investigator, and I must say that now I'm back in private practice. I always say to my clients, look, let me do the investigation. If afterwards you want to ask me for my recommendations of what could be done afterwards, by all means, but don't ask me now, because it might influence the way I do the investigation. That's my experience. Obviously, I'm sure that Emily has a much stronger brain than I have and is able to do it separately, but it is something that I have found from experience, which can be a bit of a challenge when you're an internal investigator.
I fully agree with that. To that end, I do think it's interesting to note that certain countries, particularly if you do an investigation for a federal entity in Canada, you are required, if you identify that there was or substantiate any sort of misconduct in the realm of harassment or violence, you must make recommendations on the prevention side of things, which I think to that end speaks to what these investigations are being mandated to do, go beyond presenting merely the findings and speak to something broader. But I think it's important that they be done in a well-oriented space only after you really understand what is distinguished between the facts and the findings, and how, in doing that, you can assess what needs to be taken a look at for the sort of totality of the work environment. But it is definitely challenging.
Thank you for that. Now, coming to the human drama and the emotional complexities of an investigation, Michelle, I turn to you here. There is trauma, there's fear, shame, power dynamic. How does an investigator hold space for human messiness while preserving objectivity? How do you approach interviews when you suspect trauma or fear shaping the testimony?
Well, when interviewing a scared or traumatized person, which actually in our practice happens a lot, investigators should use a very careful approach, create a safe, private setting, reserve a bit more time than usual, and explain the process even more clearly. We realized it helps also to let the individual set the pace. It is also helpful to start with even more open questions to make the interviewed person feel comfortable and well understood.
Emily, have you faced personal or professional backlash as an investigator?
I think we all have. Yes, in short answer. The response to that is, and it may not be the best one, but I think it's the fairest one, it is part of the role or the job. And I say this with a lot of admiration and respect for having done the investigations for many years. It's not a fit for everybody. It's not a career. While it's exciting and it's extremely fulfilling, it doesn't necessarily translate well for everybody, because the pressures are a little bit different than one may face in, representing a client and peddling a particular side or narrative to a file or to a mandate. Here, you have a lot of skin in the game, but at the end of the day, your neutrality and impartiality and the quality of what you deliver has to speak for itself. And it's sometimes very difficult going into mandates knowing that there is a preconceived notion or a conception around who you are and what you do. And for many, that's the reality. I have faced that, but I think it's only helped me evolve in my ability to take on work and to coach and guide and mentor folks who do this line of work as well, to say it's part of the natural progression. And that is something, you need to be keenly aware of.
Wow, thank you for that. And another part of the human messiness of in doing investigations is perhaps our own bias as investigators. And I'm going to throw this question to both Natasha and Emma. Have you felt your own identity or bias influencing the direction of your work? What are the strategies that you adopt to remain neutral and still be empathetic? And I have a confession to make in this regard. I often catch myself feeling deeply frustrated and sometimes personally let down when I see a woman behave in a flawed or harmful way. I am fully aware that this is a bias. This comes from my own conditioning of holding women to higher standards or expecting us to always know better. I'm certainly working on it, but I do realize how it can sometimes dilute neutrality.
Well, Veena, you're like all of us. You're not a machine. You're a human being, and human beings are biased. We have to accept that already. If you recognize that, a lot of people don't accept the fact that they might be biased. So already, if you know that you are biased and you know which bias you may have, that's already a great step. I think never doing an investigation alone, I think, is already an absolute must-have. I know that I always have somebody, especially when you do interviews, one of my associates with me, and we actually have a code, which I tell them, if they feel at any time that I'm losing my objectivity, they do something to let me know that, because sometimes you get a bit carried away during interviews. So having somebody there who is also watching you, observing you while you do the investigation is a good thing. I know that one of the sure signs that I'm losing objectivity is empathy. And empathy is when I feel I'm enjoying an investigation too much. Because that means I'm taking sides for somebody or something like that. So if as Emily says, it's a great job. Somebody's got to do it, but it shouldn't be fun. Okay, if you feel you're having fun, then there's a problem. And I know also in some very sensitive cases, what I've done is I actually use the red team method. I don't know if you know this, but basically I do all the investigation, and before I deliver the investigation report, I hand it over to one of my partners who's not heard about it at all, and I just say to them, look at this, dig holes, see anything you think that for you is not objective, where I could have missed something. And I think that is a very useful exercise because, yeah, it's difficult to stay objective and neutral all the time.
I think that's a great answer, Natasha. And with any advice that we would give to a client, for example, on how to check that there is or remove or mitigate the impact of personal bias, because we all have personal bias. You know, some of us like baked beans, some of us don't, and it's something that's innate in us. So firstly, recognizing that there is potential room for bias to creep in because of our personal makeup, having somebody else who will review with you the evidence. So not always is it possible to have on an investigation, have a second person sitting with you in the interviews, but having somebody who is assisting on the whole process and who will read the transcripts and with whom you can discuss the outcome and the findings is super helpful, because it then enables you to look at things from a different point of view, and all the more helpful if that person is different from you, whether that's difference in age, gender, etc. That's really important. I am from time to time part of a investigation panel, a dignity at work panel for a European institution, and it's the most interesting way I've ever done an investigation, because I would be there as the lawyer on the panel, and we look into complaints of psychological harassment and bullying. And we also have either somebody who was previously at the European Court, so somebody who's been in that environment, and then also have a psychologist as well. So it's really interesting because you have three different aspects. You're all different because you've all come from different backgrounds. And the way people ask questions is also all different. So you get a real balance in how we make our findings, as well as balance in the questions that are being asked. And Michelle said at the outset, when you've got a witness who is vulnerable, asking mainly to keep your questions open. So, and that will help you with eradicating your own personal biases as well, rather than leading people down a particular path.
Thanks, Emma. And my question is particularly relevant in the context of investigations that do with psychological safety, discrimination, harassment, bullying. When you're absorbing everyone else's story, where do you go?
I go running.
You go running. I think that's important. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think Veena, it is true. I think it can affect your own mental health, because you are faced with people who are suffering, be it the people who are complaining or the people who are accused. For the people who are accused, it can be a life-shattering experience. And it's true, it's difficult to find somebody to share with, because you're subject to confidentiality obligations, and I mean, except maybe your therapist. But I think actually having a community of investigators like the one we have today is really important, because we've all been there, we've all lived that, and yeah, I think the best shoulder to cry on is another investigator.
Super.
I think the psychological harassment is a really difficult one to absorb as an investigator. So I'm with Michelle. I'd go and do some exercise.
Yeah. I just end up sleeping extra hours
Yeah.
after something that's intense.
Could be worse. Could be worse.
Yeah.
I think that's also what I meant earlier on when I said, it's really important to have introspection in this role and be able to reflect on, how you feel in the moment, but how you feel after a situation. And like I said, this may not be for everybody, and considering the impact that it has on you and as an individual and your mental health is really important. And when all else fails, watch some really bad, mind-numbing reality TV, right? and just get a little distance from serious issues where you can. But definitely, community that we have around us is lucrative.
Yes, perfect. Sleep, run, reality TV, therapy, exercise, community. Brilliant. My last question and goes to everyone. We can take this in order. One piece of advice for young lawyers stepping into this complex world, be it internal or external. What is it that you would tell an associate who's just joining this world of investigations? Natasha, you want to start?
Yeah, and I'm sure we're all in the same, have the same experience. I have a lot of young lawyers who come and see me and say, "Oh, you do internal investigations? Oh, that's exciting. How can I do investigations?" And I tell them, well, first of all, it sounds exciting and it can be, but it's extremely demanding. It's tough work. And I think as Emily said, it's not for everybody. And if you're a bit cynical about the human race, or if you have a tendency to develop a sort of white knight syndrome, this is not for you. And so I really ask people to ask themselves, look, do you have the mindset for this? Because otherwise, at best, you're going to be disappointed. And at worst, you can really do a lot of damage while doing investigations. So that's the advice I say. Why do you want to do investigations? What do you think you're going to bring to
Thank you.
area?
Michelle?
Well, plan the investigation very carefully and prudently, and don't underestimate the order in which you conduct the interviews. This should be well thought out.
Emma?
Be methodical, and also read. There are some excellent investigation outcome reports, and in particular, there was a report which was undertaken in relation to some MPs in Parliament by Adam Tolley, and so because it was a public, it went online, and it's honestly, it's one of the best things I've read in terms of trying to work out how to do your how you can see an investigator's brain working. So I would point somebody in the direction of that.
Super. Emily?
I echo Natasha's sentiments exactly.
Super. I would say hold that empathy and humility close. The investigations that probably come our way only get more intense and more high stakes. And like you said, Natasha, we sometimes end up enjoying it a little more than we should be. And that's probably where empathy for people, the process, the organization really helps, and humility as well. Super. I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much for joining me. And for everyone who's listening to this podcast, thank you for tuning in.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Take care.